Mama Earth is pissed. She literally dropped a deluge that wiped out a conference room at COP30, and the elemental intensity didn't stop there. A fire broke out in the final days, forcing a partial evacuation out into the Amazonian heat. It's like the planetary energies themselves were sick of the lobbying and the talking and collectively pushed the touch grass agenda. Between this, the drama over the US not showing up, although that did make negotiations easier, and protesters literally blocking the main entrance, the atmosphere at COP30 was thick with tension last month, to say the least. But despite all of the chaos, the final agreement does contain some of the most hopeful, action-oriented language we've seen thus far. The question is, did world leaders, academics, and lobbyists actually do enough? That's what we're talking about today on Environmental with Dandelion. If this is your first time, you're here for an intense first episode. So, hey, hi, I'm Ob, your chief cultivator here at Dandelion Branding. We are making sustainability part of mainstream conversations by sharing sustainability stories you don't want to miss on this podcast, and by helping purpose-driven brands use their sustainability stories to create activists for their brand and their missions. Now, before we jump in, here is your reminder to tap that subscribe button. It really helps to tell the powers that be that sustainability stories matter, and that everyday lovely people like you are eco-curious and asking for the paradigm to shift. Now, we do not greenwash here at Dandelion. No. So while I'm sharing a lot of my own opinions in this episode, they're always going to be rooted in facts, and you can find all of our resources in the show notes in the description. Plus, I want to give you a little structural note before we start. You have to wait until the end of this episode for our good news today. Don't worry, it's a good little breather. Okay, ready? So this is basically part 2 of COP30. So if you're not familiar with them and what they are, I definitely recommend checking out the last episode. I really don't want to cover all of that over again here, and I sort of don't have time for that. But here's your basic download and a reminder. COPs aren't for creating specific laws or reprimands. They're for global political agreements. We cannot expect 2 weeks of conversation to bypass the 1,000 gazillion national local priorities that the leaders that are in attendance face every day. Not to mention the global colonial and patriarchal paradigm that every part of our society is built on. You've heard me talk about it before. You're going to hear me talk about it again. What the people are asking for from the COPs really is that the leaders who are currently in power diminish their own power through changing everything from energy to food to trade. And I'm going to talk about that more in depth in my final thoughts later on, because I haven't heard it talked about like this before. So for me, thinking about it offers a perspective maybe you haven't considered before, and offers maybe some context into how I'm approaching this COP30 outcome and generally COP30, the COPs in general. So what happened? So firstly, I want to have a shout out because this is one of the biggest breakthroughs we've ever seen. We are talking way more about implementation. So this is the first significant breakthrough because we are shifting from just negotiation into how to implement these changes, which included a lot of talk about how non-state actors, i.e., businesses, civil societies like you and me, or cities, or generally can play a part in the transition. So we are finally part of the conversation. Cool. We have long talked about how businesses make the fastest transition. So at least that's being recognized. For the first time, countries agreed to discuss how trade can become a bridge to climate progress rather than just something that sort of holds everybody back. The talk here is about things like low emission export costs, which can certainly make pro-climate products more appealing to buyers and everyday people. So I'm actually not going to talk about the accesses in order here because I think that 4 and 5, which were about our built environment and empowerment of women and youth, I think that generally they were like agreed upon and then sort of like brushed off. And in part, it's because we can solve a lot of these empowerment issues as we solve the tangible crisis, because women are often leaders in the sustainability movement. This is also, I think, mostly partly because we live in a patriarchy. But hey, I'm just a lady on the internet. And my prediction is going to be that we see some real backlash here and that these will be like higher on the agenda and for COPs in the future. Right now, I think the important thing is to talk about the conversation around energy, agriculture, forests, and finance, because these were the actual top conversations at COP30. So, Access 1, this is about energy and the fossil fuel phase out. And just to cut to the chase, the formal agreement was super minimal. It left out any explicit mention or a roadmap of abandoning fossil fuels. This was the most contentious debate, or one of the most contentious debate. And I'm going to talk about this mostly in my final thoughts because I think it's actually the linchpin to this whole issue. So stick around for that. The soft win here is that despite the absolute firewall, there were some mega agreements in the energy fossil fuel phase out conversation. There are voluntary roadmap discussions and financial commitments were made. They are all voluntary, but they're promising, especially since this is the first real mention of implementation towards a post fossil fuel world. Things like a $1 trillion grid and storage investment goal shows that even when there is a political hard line, the transition is being accelerated by finance and business and countries who legitimately want to shift global power dynamics in their favor. Underfunded forests, oceans, and indigenous lands. So when you look into fundings at the billion, the knee-jerk reaction is like, hell yeah, we did that. But there was a lot of pushback in the protections and the funding of forests. And it was honestly pitiful. Now, I know that I said that international trade was touted as a potential solution here, but in this case, we're still really thinking like capitalists and competitors. The reality is that the Amazon and other rainforests and sensitive ecosystems around the world are a shared responsibility of every single being on this planet. But the international community isn't budging yet on this part. There is a serious funding demarcation and equity gap for protecting our forests. Okay, so let me back up. Demarcation means legally defining the boundary of a territory. And this is what Indigenous protesters stepped up for in the middle of the conference. They're looking for full demarcation and protection of their territories, along with direct access to financing and legal recognition of their collective tenure rights. Did we get there? Not really. The Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment aims to protect 160 million hectares. And the accompanying financial pledge there was $1.8 billion. And the Tropical Forest Forever facility launched with $5.5 billion in commitments, and it offers 20% direct access funds for the Indigenous communities. But the reality is that this funding is way too low for the required momentum it's going to take here. And a lot of folks are calling this Indigenous-washing because the lack of formal land deeds prevent Indigenous peoples from even accessing that 20% of allocated funds. Now, we cannot talk about Indigenous rights, demarcation, or deforestation without talking about agriculture. The pushback was intense from industrial agriculture lobbyists, which by some records was like a third of the attendees at COP30. Please. The big ag money is no joke, okay? And as one of the biggest issues in the climate conversation, it's not surprising that they don't want things to change, right? Again, I'm going to talk about this more in my final thoughts. But here's what I noticed. There is a bunch of talk about mapping degraded lands, regenerating soil, and creating a methane commitment. I'm going to call it like it is. Okay? This is lobbyist greenwashing. There was very little talk, if any at all, about a roadmap to halt deforestation. All right, let's talk about the demarcation for the Indigenous folks. I wonder why that didn't go through, right? The agreements that did go through focus on restoring degraded land rather than stopping the initial destruction to begin with. And the billion investments in regenerative agriculture, they're not even close to enough, and they're only really being used to de-risk capital investments for private capital for millions of farmers, meaning that, yeah, okay, it's a little helpful. They gave again. But once again, big ag lobbyists push the responsibility onto individual farmers. And do not even get me started on this methane thing. All right. The $30 million global methane hub commitment is a clear indication of successful lobbying to me because it's not at all created to avoid the highly contentious livestock emissions. That's right. Not at all. It is for plant genetics, soil microbiome, and agronomy. Remember that agriculture is like 40% of human emitted methane? It's just not covered at all. Okay, good job, lobbyists. You did your job. You really showed up, and I hope your children can sleep at night knowing that you're fucking with their futures. Okay? Okay. Anyways, the last thing I want to talk about from COP30 is the big, woolly, going extinct elephant in every single room, and that's finance. Okay? Climate finance is consistently the most contentious, hardest one, and clearly the most important factor here because every single change hinges on being able to afford the transition to a more sustainable future. The vast majority of targets announced are voluntary commitments to mobilize private capital. And while that target was set for around $1 trillion a year by 2035, people who experience the climate crisis are struggling right now. Like, that's 10 years in the future. Can you imagine waiting 10 years for help? And honestly, this is just my personal opinion after 10 years of watching this and being entrenched in the sustainability conversation, running this podcast, and just generally caring about the people around me. This is so myopic and stupid, okay? 2025 UN Global Risk Assessment says that globally, we are currently already spending more than $2 trillion a year on disaster costs. This is a risk to financial stability on a global level, and that's only going to get worse as the climate crisis worsens. So, how do we reduce this? We shift to financing crisis mitigation, resilience, education, and sustainable development. In the show notes today, you can find 4 ways to support this yourself. So I will leave links there. But if you want to invest in the solution in Europe, go check out NRFIP. I love NRFIP. They also sponsor my people, Planet Pints. For investments and 401ks in the US, you want to check out Carbon Collective. They are killing it with sustainable investments. To find grants, especially in the Netherlands, but also soon generally in Europe, you want to check out subsidies.io. And we actually have an affiliate link there that will give you a free scan. So you can go check that out for your own business. And if you want to learn and you want to educate yourself and you want to step into that climate finance space, go check out the Green Program and look out for the 2026 climate finance trip to Senegal. But here's the other part of this. The countries primarily struggling with disasters right now are developing, especially those small island developing states that don't have a lot of power politically. And we are asking developed countries to help pitch in. So remember what I said about paradigms and shifting power dynamics, and let's talk about how these things play together. But before we do that, let's take a little bit of a breather. Let's get some good news rolling. More countries have said no to deep sea mining. 40 countries worldwide now push back against deep sea mining, which is incredible movement in the past year. Until science proves and can show that deep sea mining doesn't cause irreversible damage, the world must protect the deep sea. It's like really saving our asses in the climate crisis right now. Have you signed that petition yet? If not, check out the resources and the show notes for that. Okay, that was a little good news breather. What do you think? All right, Kay, you ready? Here's my final thoughts for you on COP30. In this singular environmental with Dandelion episode, and at the COPs in general, especially this one because we're talking about implementation, we've seen governments start to change how the world functions. And that's really what we're talking about here. Because global sustainability is not just a shift to renewable energy or trading on low emission products or giving money to poor countries to help them keep their access to clean water, although those things are true. But every single one of these global changes precipitates, not to be confused with trickling down, because you know how I feel about that. It precipitates a real systemic change that people in the mega power space literally don't want. And I have said this a bunch of times that shifting power shifts power. And here's what I mean by that. Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are the top 3 exporters of fossil fuels by a lot, meaning that a lot of the world is beholden to these 3 countries for their power, for their energy, which makes them globally relevant. Like, this is what makes them globally relevant. Now, I want to note here that the United States didn't even show up to COP30, that Saudi Arabia and Russia were both called out for blocking the conversation around this phase out. And it's not for nothing. This is not a coincidence. And here's Why? Here's what I think why. I mean, it's politics, right? But a joint study by the United Nations Development Program, together with University of Denver's Party Institute and Octopus Energy, released in July of this year, showed that time-bound renewable energy targets, coupled with the financing, climate finance, and policy can cut emissions, boost economies, and offer social benefits to people. It creates jobs, seriously reduces poverty, and gives people access to things like better education, healthcare, sanitization, etc. This is true on the small local scale and the large developmental scale. Now, just for a second, imagine that the folks on those small island developing states that I mentioned earlier could reduce their need for fossil fuels. What if they could make themselves less beholden to the countries that supply them their energy? But yeah, I'm going there. I'll remind you that in our society, power is an assigned social construct. So if energy or like actual power or the thing powering the phone or whatever you're watching this on is universally available, the social power assigned to those fossil fuel countries would be diminished. Okay. Yes, I know that my liberal social sciences education, blah, blah, is just coming out here. But in layman's terms, if smaller countries can make their own renewable energy, why would they need fossil fuels? And if they don't need fossil fuels, why would they need to answer to the countries supplying them? They wouldn't. They wouldn't. And that's what this boils down to, is shifting power dynamics. Shifting power shifts power. You got it. If developed countries do more than help pay for crisis intervention and they fund things like education, resilience, domestic self-reliance, the playing ground becomes more even politically and economically. That's what we're actually fighting for here. No one, not a single person ever would ever be against saving the planet, but they will fight tooth and nail against global equality. It's always going to come down to the people in power wanting to stay in power. And anything that jeopardizes that will be minimized or ignored, i.e., the US not showing up. And when that doesn't work, the people in power will throw money at it, or in this case, refuse to throw money at it, systematically lobbying against change. That's the reality. And if you want my take, we've got them backed into a corner right now, ladies and gentlemen, and they're more dangerous than ever. Animals in corners are dangerous. That's why we're seeing these huge political swings in developed countries right now. So what can you do? What can you actually do to make a difference? Well, vote. Politically, you can vote. But more than that, the difference you can make is that you can keep talking about it. And if you want to do something like right this second, you can click the like button on this episode only if you like it. We're honest here, okay? And you can send this podcast to your eco-curious friends. Because if we've learned anything today, it's that money talks and the powers that be are afraid of self-reliant, educated humans. And I aim to do both with Environmental Dandelion by giving the stage to incredible business owners who are building real solutions for the climate crisis and sharing the sustainability stories and breakdowns that you don't want to miss. And speaking of, my next podcast guest is Adam from Ecology. We're going to talk about climate credits. That's a big deal. So if you're as excited about hearing his story as I am, do not forget to subscribe so that you'll get notifications for when that comes out. And I'm very excited. We didn't know. I will see you next time. Bye.